Hi, this is Jonathan with UNLV. Today we're going to go over imported assemblies looking at the AndyMark elevator, which I'm going to download and drop into my assembly here, or to my part studio. It's going to create its own part studio for just that elevator. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure the width of my mounting rails and then compare that to the width of the elevator, and then create a cutout of the difference that I need it to contract. So once I do that, what I can do is I can select this half of the part, and I can use the transform tool to move the items that I have selected using mate connectors to move that whole part together. So the reason why I selected everything is so that all the parts move together. So I'm just confirming that the distance is good, and then I'm going to use the Boolean union tool to make those parts one piece again. Then I'm going to start looking at the side rails and start creating a mounting pattern here. I'm using a hole big enough for a 1032, as well as doing a 1-inch spacing evenly across that side. That's going to allow me to take my side rails. I'm going to do a derived sketch to look at where I wanted my elevator to be. I imported that sketch from the main sketch. And I'm going to create a gusset where that elevator is going to mount. So I'm going to create the same hole pattern, 1-inch spacing, using a hole size, I believe I used 201, and then I'm going to start creating the edges of my gusset using a bunch of circles and then lines, and then creating a bunch of tangents to those circles to ensure that I have good edge distance from those holes. Then I'm going to trim out the excess lines. I'm going to use the holes of the rail to create a couple holes and then do a pattern to make my gusset. I'm going to extrude that to, I believe I did an 1/8 inch there, and then I'm going to add that to my assembly. So once those are mounted and fastened to my assembly, I'm going to drop in the elevator and use the mounting holes that I created. I have to make sure I group my elevator assembly together so they move together, and I'm going to move it to my mounting location like we see here. So now I have the elevator on my mounting rails. Next, I'm going to go back to the part studio for my elevator and create some holes that I can use to mount some gussets to hold a motor. And right now I'm starting to draw out where I think I want that motor to be, but I'm actually going to just need the holes that are for the bottom rail there. Because then what I'm going to do is once those holes are there, I'm going to go back to my assembly and do edit in context, where I'm going to be able to do some new parts, directly being able to reference the assembly. I have a location where I want to have a bearing, so that's that 1.125 hole. I'm using the existing holes that I just created on that bottom rail to create a gusset. I'm going to give myself some material at the ends there. Trimming out what I don't need. Now I have a gusset to use for mounting a motor. And so I was going to add a rail to mount some more components, but realized I didn't need it. So now I'm going to start looking for the hole pattern that I need for a versaplanetary gearbox, because that's what I plan on modeling here. So I'm looking for the mounting hole pattern here. I see that it's a 2-inch bolt circle. So I'm going to try to mimic that pattern here. So I'm placing a bolt hole about 1 inch away from either of the sides of the hole. And then I am also realizing that I'm going to need a very similar gusset to the top, because when I run my chain up, I'm going to need a place for that second sprocket to exist on the top of that elevator. So I'm making those mounting holes. There's the mounting rail that I realized I didn't need eventually. So right now I am just adding all of these gussets to start putting together my assembly, using fastening mates on all those hole locations to keep everything fixed onto the main elevator structure. Now I'm going to use MKCad to find some bearings that I could put into those gussets. So I'm looking for a 1/2 inch hex bearing, a 25 tooth sprocket, and I am starting to mount things together to get my assembly going. Now, fast forwarding through a lot of those bearing installs, now I'm starting to align the sprockets to where I need them to be. I'm realizing that bearing needs to turn around in order for it to match how the sprocket is at the top here. So I'm going to copy that sprocket and also add it to the bottom location. Now I'm going to look for a versaplanetary gearbox, select some very general parameters. I'm not too worried about that at the moment because I'm mainly worried about getting the assembly together so all the parts fit. So right now I'm seeing that that bearing is pushed back quite a bit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of space before the motor interfaces with the gusset. So then what I can do is I can add spacers on the mounting holes to clear room for that bearing. So as you can see, I'm backing off that planetary gearbox, and I'm realizing that my gusset is a little bit too short. So then what I'm going to do is once I get all of my holes aligned, I'm going to check to see how that gusset sits there. I'm seeing, okay, yeah, it's too short. So I'm going to go back to that part for the gusset, and I'm going to give it a little bit more height. So I'm going back to that gusset drawing, change that to 2 inches, seeing how that goes. Oh, look, I got space. So we are good with that mounting. Next, I'm going to look for a way to put a chain on there. So I'm specifying the sprocket teeth number for each of those, as well as identifying what the distance is between the two centers of those holes. And I'm realizing that I made my elevator way too tall compared to my main sketch, so I'm going to shorten it the same way that we did before with making it more narrow, moving the pieces together using a transform, as well as then Boolean union to connect those parts back together. So I'm playing around with some heights there, and now I have it back on my assembly. Now it's a lot more of a squat elevator, and now I have my distance, so I can select the radius of my sprocket to create my gear, or my chain interface, which I am seeing that it is not quite the right size, so I'm checking some dimensions, and I'm readjusting the distance to get my distance correct. I'm also noticing that it's not centered on that sprocket, so I'm giving it a little bit of an offset so that it is able to be centered on that at a reasonable location. Next, I'm going to do a sketch on the top of the elevator carriage. I'm going to do this so that I can figure out a good location to mount the chain clamp so that it can attach to the chain and allow the carriage to ride up and down. So doing my typical hole pattern, 1-inch spacing, 201 holes, looking at the chain. Now I'm going to try to figure out how to hold onto the chain. So I'm going to go into an editing context, really looking at that top elevator carriage piece. Now I'm going to create a shape that can mount to that carriage as well as clamp the chain. So I'm going to give it some dimensions, making it 1 inch total width. I'm going to grab those holes so I could fasten it to the carriage. I'm going to try to center that 1-inch marking on that hole. It's tangent right now. I remove that tangent, make that incident to the center, give it some extrusion. So now I have a surface that tries to grab that hole. So looking at the chain attachment link on AndyMark, downloading the CAD for that to try to see where my holes need to go. Realizing it's a little bit too short, so I'm bringing out a little bit. Then I'm creating a center line, trying to get the center of that chain. So I am creating a construction line that I'm going to make incident to both sides of that chain. It's giving me a little bit of trouble, but I finally get it. And then I'm going to center that construction line so I can put 2 holes on the left and the right side of that center line that match the hole locations of my chain attachment piece. I'm realizing that it's slightly too tall, so I'm going to drop that down, and I'm going to make it 1 inch tall and put the holes at 1/2 inch high. So I can do this with an 1 inch by 1 inch stock. I got my piece, download the CAD for the chain attachment, upload that to my assembly, insert that into this assembly. So now I can use the fastening feature to mate to my mounting block. And now I have a I'm realizing that the edge is a little bit too close to the chain block, so I'm going to try to move this part back to give it a little bit of room so I could have a radius there as well as enough space for the chain attachment piece. So now I got that. Next is just going to be some assembly work on the top level. So I'm going to go back to my top level assembly, update my mounting rails that I had already put onto my top level assembly. So once I get this updated and versioned, I should be able to see what the elevator looks like on top of the chassis. So there it is. And now I'm going to try to start to kind of clean up this assembly, just looking around, seeing what I want to do next. Now I'm going to go back to my elevator assembly and I'm going to start adding in things like shaft collars so that they can lock in the bearings. I'm putting the shaft collars first so I could measure the distance between the ends of the shaft collars so I can create a hex shaft at the right distance between those components. So I'm moving that, trying to figure out a way if I can get it without the retention ring, because I don't really need the retention ring. So I'm going to do shaft collar, create my distance. So now I don't have the snap rings, and add it to the, or made it to the ends of that, of those shaft collars. And then now I should put a shaft collar on that bottom, and I think I just forgot. But there is the elevator assembly. Thanks.